The warm breeze from the sea brushed against my face as I hauled my toolbox up the ladder. After a long day working the docks, I was wiped out, but that leaking roof wasn't going to fix itself. The sun was just setting, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges. I thought I had a few quiet hours to get the job done. Then I saw her, Linda Miller, HOA president, phone in hand, eyes sharp as a hawk, ready to shut me down. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy. Mark Stevens never imagined he would find himself at the center of such a storm. He sat in his modest house on the outskirts of Millbrook, a small town in rural Pennsylvania, watching through his window as the evening light slowly faded over the neighboring rooftops. In his hands, he held the letter that had arrived that morning. A termination notice from the factory where he had worked for the past 2 decades. Due to reorganization and workforce reduction, the words lined up one after another, but Mark wasn't really reading them anymore. He knew what lay behind those cold, bureaucratic phrases. He knew who was behind it and why his name had been specifically chosen from among the 300 employees at Millbrook Manufacturing. 3 months ago, Mark had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see. Working the late shift in the chemical processing section, he had noticed unusual activity around the waste disposal area. Trucks coming and going at odd hours, containers being moved without proper documentation, and most disturbing of all, the acrid smell that had begun permeating the air around the old Wilson Creek that ran behind the factory. Wilson Creek. The same creek where his children had played as toddlers, where the town held its annual fishing derby, where 3 generations of Millbrook families had created memories. Now, when Mark drove past it on his way to work, he could see the unnatural discoloration of the water and smell the chemical tang that made his eyes water. The factory was owned by North Star Industries, a multinational corporation that had purchased the local facility 5 years ago with promises of job security and environmental responsibility. The plant manager, Richard Coleman, had been brought in from corporate headquarters with a mandate to increase profits and streamline operations. Coleman was a man in his 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to calculate the monetary value of everything they looked upon. Mark had tried to do the right thing. He had documented what he saw, taken photographs when he could, and eventually approached his supervisor, Tom Bradley, a man he had known since high school. "Tom, we need to talk about what's happening with the waste disposal," Mark had said one Friday afternoon, staying behind after his shift ended. Tom had looked uncomfortable, glancing around the empty break room before responding. "Mark, you're a good worker, and I respect you, but some things are better left alone. You've got a family to think about." "That's exactly why I can't leave it alone," Mark had replied. "My kids live in this town. Everyone's kids live here. If they're dumping toxic waste into Wilson Creek—" "You don't know that's what's happening," Tom had interrupted. "And even if something irregular is going on, it's way above our pay grade. Coleman answers to people in corporate, and they answer to people even higher up. You think your opinion matters to them." But Mark couldn't let it go. He had grown up in Millbrook, had met his wife Sarah at the high school homecoming dance, had watched his children take their first steps in the town park. This place wasn't just where he lived, it was who he was. The next week, he had requested a meeting with Coleman directly. The plant manager had received him in his spacious office overlooking the factory floor, gesturing for Mark to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his mahogany desk. "Mr. Stevens, isn't it?" Coleman had said, not looking up from the papers he was reviewing. "Tom tells me you have some concerns about our operations." "Yes, sir. I've noticed some irregularities in the waste disposal procedures, and I'm worried we might not be in compliance with EPA regulations." Coleman had finally looked up, his cold gray eyes fixing on Mark with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Mr. Stevens, you've been with this company for 20 years. That's commendable loyalty. I'd hate to see you throw that away over misunderstandings." "I don't think I'm misunderstanding what I've seen, Mr. Coleman. Unmarked trucks, containers without proper hazmat labels, Discharge into the creek that looks and smells like chemical runoff. What you've seen, Coleman had said, his voice taking on a harder edge, is a manufacturing operation that employs 300 people in a town of 8,000. Without this factory, Millbrook would dry up and blow away. Every job, every local business, every family depends on what we do here. I trust you understand the broader implications of wild accusations. Mark had felt the threat underlying the words, but he had pressed on. If we're violating environmental regulations, the company could face huge fines, lawsuits, criminal charges. Wouldn't it be better to address these issues now before? Before what, Mr. Stevens? Before you go running to the EPA with half-baked theories and blurry photographs? Before you destroy the livelihoods of your neighbors and friends? Before you make yourself into the man who killed this town? The meeting had ended there, with Coleman dismissing Mark with a curt nod and a final warning about the dangers of overactive imagination. Now, 3 months later, Mark held his termination letter and knew that Coleman had made good on his implicit threat. The official reason was workforce reduction, but Mark noticed that several workers with less seniority had kept their jobs. He also noticed that his access to the areas where he had witnessed the suspicious activity had been restricted in the weeks leading up to his firing. Sarah found him still sitting at the kitchen table when she returned from her job at the county clerk's office. She was a petite woman with auburn hair and green eyes that had always been able to see through his attempts to hide his worries. "What's that?" she asked, nodding toward the letter in his hands. Mark handed it to her without speaking, watching her face as she read. Her expression moved through surprise, anger, and finally settled into a grim determination that he recognized from their 23 years of marriage. "This is about Wilson Creek, isn't it?" she said. Mark nodded. "Coleman warned me, but I hoped they wouldn't actually." "The bastards," Sarah said, her voice quiet but fierce. 20 years you've given to that place. 20 years of night shifts and overtime and breathing God knows what kind of fumes. And this is how they repay you for trying to do the right thing." Their daughter Emma, home from her sophomore year at State University, looked up from her laptop at the kitchen counter. At 20, she had inherited her mother's directness and her father's sense of justice. "What's going on?" she asked. Sarah handed her the letter. Emma read it quickly, her face darkening with anger. "They can't do this," she said. "There have to be laws against retaliation for whistleblowing." "There are," Mark said. "But proving retaliation is another matter. On paper, this looks like a straightforward layoff. They've got their documentation in order." Their 16-year-old son Jake came downstairs, drawn by the tension in his family's voices. He was at that age where everything seemed like a crisis, but this time, Mark thought grimly, the crisis was real. "Dad lost his job," Emma told him bluntly. Jake's eyes widened. "What? Why?" Mark looked at his children, Emma with her fierce intelligence, Jake with his earnest concern, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. These were the people he was supposed to protect and provide for. These were the reasons he should probably keep his mouth shut and find another job. But then he thought about Wilson Creek, about the other families in town, about the children who would grow up drinking poisoned water and breathing polluted air if someone didn't speak up. "I've been documenting what I believe are illegal waste disposal practices at the factory," he told his children. "I tried to address it through proper channels, but instead of investigating, they decided to get rid of me." Emma leaned forward, her reporter's instincts already engaged. She was studying journalism at the university and had spent the summer interning at the regional newspaper. "What kind of evidence do you have?" she asked. Mark went to his study and returned with a thick folder. Inside were photographs taken with his cell phone, notes documenting dates and times of unusual activity, copies of work orders that seemed suspicious, and a water sample he had secretly collected from Wilson Creek. "I had the water tested at a private lab in the city," he said. "The results show elevated levels of several toxic chemicals that are used in our manufacturing process." Sarah examined the lab report, her background in the county clerk's office having given her experience with official documents. "These numbers, are they dangerous?" "According to EPA guidelines, yes." The levels of trichloroethylene and benzene are both well above safe drinking water standards. Jake looked confused. But we don't drink from the creek. We have city water. The creek feeds into the groundwater system, Mark explained. And eventually, it flows into the Susquehanna River, which is a source of drinking water for hundreds of thousands of people downstream. Emma was taking notes, her journalistic training kicking in. Have you contacted the EPA or the State Environmental Agency? Not yet. I wanted to try to resolve it internally first. I thought if I could convince Coleman or someone at corporate that they were exposing the company to huge legal liability. You thought they'd thank you for pointing out their crimes? Sarah asked, not unkindly. Mark, you've always believed that people will do the right thing if you just show them the facts. But sometimes the facts are inconvenient, and some people would rather shoot the messenger. Mark knew she was right. His faith in human decency had always been both his greatest strength and his most glaring weakness. He believed that most people, given the choice between doing right and doing wrong, would choose right. But Coleman and North Star Industries weren't most people. They were a corporate machine designed to maximize profits, and environmental responsibility was just another cost to be minimized. The family sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about what came next. Finally, Emma spoke up. We have to take this public, she said. If the company won't police itself, then we have to make sure the authorities know what's happening. It's not that simple, Mark said. Coleman was right about one thing. This factory is the economic lifeblood of Millbrook. If North Star shuts down operations here because of an environmental investigation, hundreds of people lose their jobs. I'd be the man who destroyed this town. And if you don't speak up, Sarah said, you'd be the man who let his neighbors and their children get poisoned. Which is worse? Mark didn't have an answer for that. He had been wrestling with the same question for 3 months, and it had only gotten harder now that the stakes were personal. With his termination, the battle had moved from the abstract realm of corporate responsibility into the very concrete world of his family's financial security. The Stevens family had never been wealthy, but Mark's factory job had provided a steady middle-class income. Sarah's position at the county clerk's office brought in additional money, but not nearly enough to cover the mortgage, car payments, and college tuition. Emma's education was partially funded by scholarships and student loans, but Jake was only 2 years away from college himself. How long can we last without your income? Sarah asked, addressing the practical concerns that would soon become urgent. Mark had already done the math. 3 months, maybe 4 if we're really careful. After that, we'd have to start dipping into the kids' college funds, and even those wouldn't last long. I could take a leave of absence from school, Emma offered. Come home and get a job to help out. Absolutely not, Mark said firmly. Your education is too important. I could get a part-time job, Jake added. Maybe at the grocery store or something. You're 16, Sarah said. Your job is to focus on school and getting into college yourself. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Mark went to answer it and found Tom Bradley standing on his porch, looking uncomfortable and glancing around as if he expected to be watched. Tom, Mark said, surprised. Come in. Tom shook his head. I can't stay. I just wanted to. I'm sorry about what happened, Mark. You're a good man, and this isn't right. Then help me make it right, Mark said. You've seen what I've seen. You know what's happening. Tom looked even more uncomfortable. I've got 37 years in at that plant, Mark. 3 years until I can retire with full benefits. I can't. I just can't. Mark felt a flash of anger but suppressed it. Tom was scared, and he had good reasons to be. At 59 years old, with no college education and a skill set that was specific to manufacturing, he would never find another job that paid half of what North Star was paying him. I understand, Mark said. I really do. But Tom, what if it was your grandkids playing in that creek? Tom's face crumpled slightly. They don't play there anymore. I told my daughter to keep them away from the water. The admission hung in the air between them. Tom knew the creek was contaminated, but he was more afraid of losing his job than he was committed to protecting the community. Be careful, Mark, Tom said finally. Coleman's not done with you. There are rumors he's been making calls, trying to make sure you don't find work anywhere in the county. After Tom left, Mark shared this information with his family. The implications were sobering. If Coleman was actively working to blacklist him from other jobs, the family's financial situation could become desperate much more quickly than he had anticipated. That's illegal too, Emma pointed out. Interference with someone's ability to find employment. Proving it would be nearly impossible, Sarah said. And even if we could prove it, the damage would already be done. Mark made a decision that would change everything that followed. I'm going to contact the EPA tomorrow morning. And the State Environmental Agency. If Coleman wants to play hardball, then we'll play hardball. Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. Are you sure? Once you make this official, there's no going back. Coleman and North Star will use every weapon they have against us. I'm sure, Mark said, though his voice betrayed some uncertainty. I have to be sure, because the alternative is watching this community get slowly poisoned while I stay quiet to protect my job. And I don't have that job anymore anyway. Emma was already on her laptop. I'm going to start researching environmental attorneys. If you're going to blow the whistle on North Star, you're going to need legal protection. As the family began to plan their next moves, none of them could have predicted how vicious the battle would become or how much it would cost them before it was over. The Millbrook EPA field office was located in a nondescript government building 20 miles from town. Mark had made an appointment with Maria Rodriguez, the regional environmental enforcement officer, and spent a sleepless night rehearsing what he would say. Rodriguez was a woman in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that suggested she had seen too much environmental damage to be easily shocked. She listened without interruption as Mark presented his evidence, occasionally asking for clarification or requesting to see specific documents. Mr. Stevens, she said when he had finished, what you're describing, if accurate, represents serious violations of the Clean Water Act and potentially the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. The penalties for this kind of illegal dumping could reach into the tens of millions of dollars. So you'll investigate? Mark asked. I'll initiate a preliminary review of your evidence, yes. But I have to warn you, investigations of major corporations are complex and can take months or even years to complete. And there's always the possibility that North Star will claim that any violations have been corrected and that further legal action is unnecessary. Mark felt a surge of frustration. What about the contamination that's already occurred? What about the ongoing health risks to the community? If we find evidence of immediate threats to public health, we can seek emergency injunctions to halt operations. But based on what you've shown me, while the contamination is concerning, it may not meet the threshold for immediate emergency action. Rodriguez walked Mark through the process that would unfold. The EPA would conduct its own water sampling, would request documentation from North Star, and would eventually schedule inspections of the facility. The company would have opportunities to contest the findings and to negotiate settlement agreements that might include fines but not admission of wrongdoing. The wheels of environmental justice turn slowly, Mr. Stevens. But they do turn. What you've done by bringing this forward is important, regardless of how long it takes to reach resolution. Mark left the meeting feeling simultaneously hopeful and frustrated. The system was designed to be methodical and thorough, but methodical and thorough didn't help the people of Millbrook who were being exposed to toxins every day. His next stop was the office of David Chen, an environmental attorney Emma had found through her research. Chen specialized in whistleblower cases and had a track record of successful settlements against major corporations. Chen was younger than Mark had expected, probably in his early 30s, with an intense energy that reminded Mark of Emma when she was pursuing a story. His office was cluttered with legal documents and environmental reports, suggesting a practice focused on technical environmental cases rather than general corporate law. Mr. Stevens, I've reviewed the materials you sent over, Chen began. You have a potentially strong case, both for the underlying environmental violations and for retaliation against you personally. What are the risks? Mark asked. My family is already facing financial hardship because of my termination. Chen leaned back in his chair. The biggest risk is that this could take years to resolve, and there's no guarantee of victory. North Star will hire a team of lawyers whose job is to make this as expensive and time-consuming as possible for you. They'll challenge every piece of evidence, question your motives, and try to paint you as a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. And the benefits if we win? Potentially significant. Whistleblower settlements in environmental cases have ranged from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. Plus, there's the possibility of stopping ongoing environmental damage and protecting public health. Mark asked about the costs of pursuing legal action. Chen explained that he would take the case on a contingency basis, meaning he would only be paid if they won or reached a settlement. However, there would be costs for expert witnesses, environmental testing, and document production that could run into the tens of thousands of dollars. I understand your family is facing financial pressure, Chen said. There are some environmental groups that sometimes help fund these kinds of cases. Let me make some calls and see what might be available. Mark left Chen's office with a stack of legal documents to review and sign. The complexity of the legal process was daunting, but he felt like he was finally taking concrete action to address the problems he had witnessed. When he arrived home, he found Sarah in the kitchen making phone calls. She had been contacting their creditors to explain their situation and request payment deferrals where possible. "How did it go?" she asked, hanging up the phone. Mark filled her in on his meetings with Rodriguez and Chen. Sarah listened carefully, asking practical questions about timelines and costs. "Emma called," she said. "She's been in touch with her journalism professor, and they think this could be a significant story. She wants to come home this weekend to interview you and start putting together an article." Mark felt uneasy about media attention. "I'm not sure that's a good idea yet. Chen said we should be careful about public statements while the EPA investigation is getting started." Emma knows how to be careful. "And honestly, Mark, we might need the media attention. If this turns into a long legal battle, public pressure might be the only thing that forces North Star to take us seriously." That evening, Jake came home from school with disturbing news. Word of Mark's situation had spread through the community, and the reactions were mixed. "Some people are supporting you, Dad," Jake said. "Mrs. Patterson said she thinks you're brave for standing up to the big corporation. But others are really angry. Tommy Morrison's dad works at the factory, and he said if the plant closes because of you, he's going to make you pay for it." Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. He had expected pushback from North Star, but he hadn't fully considered how the community itself might be divided. Many families in Millbrook depended on the factory for their livelihoods, and they might see him as a threat to their economic security rather than a protector of their health. Sarah put her hand on his shoulder. "We knew this wouldn't be easy." "I know," Mark said. "I just hoped the community would understand that I'm trying to protect them, not hurt them." The next morning brought the first sign that Coleman was escalating his campaign against the Stevens family. Jake came downstairs looking upset, holding his cell phone. "Dad, there's stuff about you on social media," he said. "Somebody started a Facebook group called Stop Mark Stevens from Destroying Millbrook. They're saying you're a liar and a troublemaker who's trying to get attention by attacking the company that employs half the town." Mark looked at the posts Jake showed him on his phone. The language was harsh and personal, attacking not just his credibility but his character and motives. Some posts suggested that he was mentally unstable, others claimed he was being paid by competing companies to sabotage North Star's operations. "Who's behind this?" Mark asked. "It looks like it was started by someone named Mike Coleman. Isn't that the plant manager's last name?" Mark's anger flared. Coleman wasn't content with firing him and trying to blacklist him from other jobs. Now he was orchestrating a social media campaign to destroy his reputation in the community. Emma arrived home that Friday evening, her car packed with recording equipment and research materials. She had been working with her journalism professor to develop an investigative piece about environmental violations in small-town America, using her father's case as a specific example. "I've been researching North Star Industries," she told the family over dinner. "They have a history of environmental violations at other facilities. Fines, cleanup orders, at least 2 criminal prosecutions of plant managers for illegal dumping." Emma had printed out dozens of news articles and regulatory documents from North Star facilities in other states. The pattern was clear. The company routinely violated environmental regulations, paid relatively small fines when caught, and continued operations with minimal changes. It's cheaper for them to pay fines than to properly handle their waste, Emma explained. The maximum penalties are a fraction of what it would cost to install proper treatment systems. That's why cases like yours are so important, Dad. Individual whistleblowers are often the only way these violations come to light. Mark appreciated his daughter's support, but he was becoming increasingly aware of the personal cost of his decision. The social media attacks were intensifying, and he had received several hostile phone calls from anonymous callers who accused him of trying to destroy the town. The most painful moment came when Mark ran into his former neighbor, Bill Patterson, at the grocery store. Bill was a man Mark had known for 15 years, someone he had helped move furniture and whose lawn mower he had borrowed countless times. "Mark," Bill said, his voice cold, "I heard about what you're doing." "Bill, I'm trying to protect the community. The water contamination affects everyone. The only thing affecting everyone is the possibility that you'll get the plant shut down. My son-in-law works there, my brother works there. You're talking about destroying hundreds of jobs over some theory about water quality." "It's not a theory," Mark said, keeping his voice calm despite his frustration. "I have test results showing dangerous levels of toxic chemicals." "From where? Some creek behind the plant?" "Nobody drinks from that creek, Mark. But plenty of people depend on those jobs to feed their families." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but it was clear that Bill's mind was made up. From his perspective, Mark was choosing abstract environmental concerns over the concrete economic needs of his neighbors. Walking home from the store, Mark realized that this conversation would be repeated dozens of times in the coming months. The community was being forced to choose between their immediate economic interests and their long-term health and environmental safety. For many people, especially those living paycheck to paycheck, the choice seemed obvious. That weekend, Emma conducted extensive interviews with Mark about his experiences at the factory, his evidence of environmental violations, and his treatment by company management. She also interviewed Sarah about the family's decision to pursue the case despite the personal and financial costs. "What would you say to people who think you're putting the community's economic welfare at risk?" Emma asked her father. Mark had been thinking about this question since his encounter with Bill Patterson. "I'd say that poisoning the community isn't an acceptable price for maintaining jobs. Yes, people need work to support their families. But they also need clean water and safe air for their families. A company that can't operate without breaking environmental laws isn't a company worth protecting. And if the plant shuts down? If hundreds of people lose their jobs? Then North Star Industries will be responsible for that, not me. They're the ones who chose to violate environmental regulations. They're the ones who chose to fire employees who tried to address the problem internally. They're the ones who could fix these problems and continue operating legally, but they'd rather fight to maintain their illegal practices." Emma's article was published in the regional newspaper the following week, with the headline, "Local Worker Exposes Toxic Dumping at Millbrook Plant." The piece presented Mark's allegations alongside North Star's denial of any wrongdoing and their characterization of him as a disgruntled former employee making unfounded accusations. The article generated significant regional attention and was picked up by environmental advocacy groups as an example of corporate environmental abuse. But it also intensified the backlash against Mark in the local community. The day after the article was published, Mark found his mailbox had been vandalized, with the words, "Town Killer," spray-painted across it in red letters. Sarah's car tires were slashed while it was parked at the county courthouse, and Jake reported that several classmates had stopped speaking to him entirely. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted to Mark one evening. "I'm proud of you for doing the right thing, but I'm scared about what this is going to do to our family." Mark shared her fears, but he also felt trapped by the logic of the situation. Having already lost his job and his reputation in the community, backing down now would accomplish nothing positive while ensuring that the environmental contamination continued. "We're past the point of no return," he said. "The only way through this is forward." 6 weeks after Mark first contacted the EPA, Maria Rodriguez called to inform him that the agency had completed its preliminary testing of Wilson Creek and the groundwater around the North Star facility. The results confirmed Mark's worst fears and validated his decision to speak out. "Mr. Stevens, I need to inform you that our tests have found significant contamination in both surface and groundwater around the plant," Rodriguez said. "We're documenting violations of the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. This is now a priority enforcement case." Mark felt a surge of vindication mixed with concern for his community. What happens next? "We're issuing violations notices to North Star Industries and requiring them to immediately cease any activities that might be contributing to the contamination. We're also requiring them to submit detailed records of their waste disposal practices for the past 5 years. Rodriguez explained that the EPA would be expanding its investigation and that Mark might be called upon to provide additional testimony and evidence. She also warned him that North Star would likely intensify their efforts to discredit him and his allegations. Companies facing major environmental violations often try to shift the focus from their own behavior to the motives and credibility of the whistleblowers, she said. "Be prepared for that." Mark shared the news with David Chen, his attorney, who was pleased but not surprised by the EPA's findings. "This strengthens both the environmental case and your retaliation claim," Chen said. "The fact that the EPA has confirmed your allegations makes it much harder for North Star to paint you as a disgruntled employee making false accusations." Chen had news of his own. He had been in contact with the Environmental Protection Network, a nonprofit that provided funding and support for environmental whistleblowers. They were interested in Mark's case and were prepared to help cover the costs of expert witnesses and additional environmental testing. "This means we can pursue this case as aggressively as North Star pursues their defense," Chen explained. "We won't be outgunned financially." The validation from the EPA and the legal support from environmental advocates were encouraging, but they did nothing to improve Mark's situation in Millbrook. If anything, the official confirmation of environmental violations made the community's hostility toward him more intense. The Facebook group opposing Mark had grown to over 800 members, nearly 10% of the town's population. The posts had become increasingly personal and vitriolic, with some suggesting that Mark should be driven out of town or physically confronted. Richard Coleman held a town hall meeting at the high school auditorium, ostensibly to address community concerns about the EPA investigation. In reality, it became a platform for attacking Mark's credibility and motivations. The EPA investigation was triggered by the allegations of a single former employee who was terminated for cause, Coleman told the packed auditorium. Mark Stevens has provided no evidence of actual environmental harm, only speculation and innuendo designed to damage this company's reputation. Coleman went on to emphasize the economic importance of the North Star facility to Millbrook, noting that the company employed 300 people directly and supported hundreds of additional jobs in local businesses. He suggested that the EPA investigation was part of a broader government overreach that threatened manufacturing jobs throughout the region. "We are cooperating fully with the EPA's investigation, and we are confident that it will show our operations are in full compliance with all environmental regulations," Coleman said. "But we cannot allow the unfounded accusations of one individual to destroy the economic foundation of this community." Several community members spoke in support of Coleman's message, including the mayor, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, and the owner of the town's largest restaurant. Each emphasized their concern that negative publicity from the EPA investigation would drive away other businesses and reduce property values. Mark had not been invited to speak at the town hall, but Emma attended and took notes. She reported back that the meeting was essentially a coordinated attack on her father's credibility and character. "They made you sound like some kind of environmental terrorist who wants to destroy the town out of spite," Emma said. And most of the audience seemed to buy it. The town hall meeting was covered by local media, and the coverage was decidedly unsympathetic to Mark's position. The headline in the Millbrook Gazette read, "Community Leaders Rally Against EPA Investigation," and the article focused primarily on concerns about job losses and economic impact. Mark was quoted in the article, but his comments about environmental contamination and public health were buried near the end of the story, while Coleman's dismissal of his allegations was prominently featured. The media coverage and community hostility began to take a toll on the entire Stevens family. Sarah faced hostile comments from some of her co-workers at the county clerk's office, and there were rumors that the county commissioners were considering whether her position represented a conflict of interest. Jake's situation at school became increasingly difficult. While some of his classmates and teachers supported his father's actions, others made it clear that they blamed Mark for threatening the town's economic stability. Jake found himself defending his father's integrity and motives on a daily basis. "I don't understand why people can't see that Dad is trying to help them," Jake said to his mother one evening after a particularly difficult day at school. Sarah tried to explain the complex dynamics at work. "People are scared, Jake. They're scared of losing their jobs, scared of change, scared of uncertainty. When people are scared, they sometimes attack the person who brought them bad news instead of addressing the actual problem." Emma's situation was different but equally challenging. Her article about the environmental contamination had been well received in journalism circles and had led to interest from national environmental publications. However, some faculty and students at her university criticized her for writing about her own family's situation, suggesting that her personal involvement compromised her objectivity as a journalist. "My journalism ethics professor says I should have disclosed my family relationship more prominently in the article," Emma told her parents during a phone call. "And one of my classmates suggested I might be making up details to make my father look like a hero." Mark felt guilty about the impact his decision was having on his family members. Each of them was paying a price for his choice to speak out about the environmental violations, and there were times when he wondered if the cost was too high. Those doubts were partially alleviated when he received a phone call from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a public health researcher at the State University. Dr. Walsh had read Emma's article and was interested in conducting a study of potential health impacts from the contamination around the North Star facility. "Mr. Stevens, I've been researching environmental health issues in rural communities for 15 years, Dr. Walsh said. "What you've documented at the Millbrook plant fits a pattern I've seen in dozens of similar cases. Would you be willing to help me gather data for a comprehensive health study?" Dr. Walsh explained that she wanted to test soil and water samples from around the plant, survey residents about health symptoms that might be related to chemical exposure, and analyze cancer rates and other health statistics for the Millbrook area. "This kind of study takes time to complete, but it could provide definitive evidence of whether the contamination you've documented is actually harming public health," she said. Mark agreed to cooperate with Dr. Walsh's research, seeing it as another way to build the case for addressing the environmental problems. However, he also knew that a health study would likely intensify the community's hostility toward him, since it would be seen as another attack on the plant and the jobs it provided. Dr. Walsh's initial findings were disturbing. Soil samples taken from residential areas near the plant showed elevated levels of the same chemicals Mark had found in Wilson Creek. More troubling, preliminary health surveys suggested higher than normal rates of respiratory problems, skin conditions, and certain types of cancer in neighborhoods closest to the facility. "The data is still preliminary," Dr. Walsh cautioned, "but there appear to be statistically significant correlations between proximity to the plant and certain health issues. We'll need months of additional research to establish causation, but the patterns are concerning." Mark shared this information with his attorney and with Maria Rodriguez at the EPA. Both saw Dr. Walsh's research as strengthening the case against North Star, but they also warned that the company would likely attack the methodology and conclusions of the health study. North Star will hire their own health experts to dispute Dr. Walsh's findings, Chin predicted. They'll argue that correlation doesn't prove causation, that other factors could explain the health patterns, and that the study sample is too small to draw valid conclusions. As predicted, North Star's response to the health study was swift and aggressive. The company issued a statement questioning Dr. Walsh's qualifications and suggesting that her research was biased because it was initiated based on allegations from a disgruntled former employee. Coleman also organized a second town hall meeting, this time featuring a panel of experts hired by North Star to discuss environmental health issues. The panel included a toxicologist who argued that the chemical levels found in the area were too low to cause health problems, an epidemiologist who questioned Dr. Walsh's methodology, and an economist who presented detailed analyses of the potential job losses if the plant were forced to close. The meeting was professionally orchestrated, with slick PowerPoint presentations and carefully prepared talking points. The experts presented themselves as objective scientists concerned only with facts and public safety, while subtly undermining Dr. Walsh's credibility and Mark's motives. Environmental fear-mongering has become a cottage industry, the toxicologist told the audience. Activists and opportunistic researchers make careers out of frightening communities with unsubstantiated claims about trace chemical exposures that pose no real health risks. Mark attended the meeting, sitting in the back of the auditorium and listening to his life's work being dismissed and his character being assassinated by people who had never met him. When the moderator opened the floor for questions, he stood up to speak. "My name is Mark Stevens," he began, and immediately felt the temperature in the room drop as hundreds of faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. "I worked at the North Star plant for 20 years. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to attack my employer and destroy my community. I saw evidence of illegal dumping that was contaminating our water supply, and I tried to address it through proper channels. When the company refused to investigate or respond, I had no choice but to contact regulatory authorities." The room buzzed with murmurs and comments, some supportive but many hostile. Coleman, sitting on the panel at the front of the auditorium, watched Mark with cold eyes. "Mr. Stevens," the toxicologist said, "you're not a scientist. You have no training in environmental chemistry or public health. How can you be certain that what you observed represents a threat to the community?" "I can't be certain," Mark replied. "That's why I contacted the EPA and why Dr. Walsh is conducting her study. I wanted experts to evaluate the evidence and determine whether there's a real problem. But I do know what I saw: unmarked trucks dumping waste into Wilson Creek at night, chemical smells that made my eyes water, discolored water that killed fish. Maybe I'm wrong about the health risks, but shouldn't we find out for sure rather than just assume everything is fine?" A man near the front of the auditorium stood up. Mark recognized him as Gary Morrison, whose son Jake had mentioned earlier. "Mark, my family has lived here for 3 generations, Morrison said. "My father worked at that plant, I work there, and I hope my son will work there someday. You're asking us to risk all of that based on your suspicions. Even if there is some contamination, is it really worth destroying the economic foundation of our community?" Mark felt the weight of the question. It wasn't unfair, and he understood the man's concerns. But he also thought about his own children and grandchildren, about the long-term consequences of allowing environmental contamination to continue. "Gary, I understand your concerns, and I respect your family's history with the plant," Mark said. "But I have to ask, if it was your kids playing near that creek, if it was your family drinking water that might be contaminated, would you want someone to speak up? Would you want them to stay quiet to protect jobs?" "That's not a fair comparison," Morrison replied. "You're talking about theoretical risks to theoretical future health problems. I'm talking about real families losing real income right now." The exchange continued for several more minutes, with other community members joining the debate. Some supported Mark's position, arguing that environmental protection was more important than short-term economic concerns. Others sided with Morrison, suggesting that Mark was being selfish and reckless with other people's livelihoods. When Mark finally sat down, he felt emotionally drained but also clearer about his position. The community was genuinely divided, with reasonable people reaching different conclusions about the same set of facts. The tragedy was that they were being forced to choose between economic security and environmental safety, when they should have been able to demand both. After the meeting, Mark was approached by several people who expressed support for his actions but asked that he not mention their names publicly. They were afraid of retaliation from North Star or social ostracism from their neighbors. One of these supporters was Helen Martinez, a nurse at the local clinic who had worked in Millbrook for 12 years. "Mark, I can't say this publicly because I need my job," she said quietly, "but we've been seeing some concerning patterns at the clinic. More respiratory problems, more skin conditions, more cases of certain types of cancer than we used to see. I can't prove it's connected to the plant, but the timing is suspicious." Another supporter was retired teacher Margaret Thompson, who had taught 3 generations of Millbrook children. "I've been watching this town for 60 years, she told Mark. "I remember when Wilson Creek ran clear and children could swim in it safely. I remember when the air didn't smell like chemicals after certain weather patterns. Something has changed, and it's not just progress." These private expressions of support were encouraging, but they also highlighted the climate of fear that North Star had created in the community. People were afraid to speak publicly about their concerns because they feared economic retaliation or social ostracism. The pressure was taking its toll on Mark's mental health. He had always been a social person who derived energy from his connections with neighbors and coworkers. The isolation and hostility he now faced was profoundly depressing, and there were days when he struggled to get out of bed. Sarah suggested that he talk to someone professionally about the stress he was experiencing. Mark resisted initially, seeing it as a sign of weakness, but eventually agreed to see Dr. Patricia Collins, a counselor who specialized in helping people deal with work-related stress and trauma. "What you're experiencing is called moral injury," Dr. Collins explained during their first session. "It's what happens when people are forced to choose between their ethical principles and their practical needs, or when they face severe consequences for doing what they believe is right." Dr. Collins helped Mark understand that his emotional struggles were a normal response to an abnormal situation. She also helped him develop strategies for managing the stress and maintaining his mental health during what would likely be a prolonged battle. "You need to remember that you can't control how other people respond to your actions," she said. "You can only control your own choices and your own behavior. You chose to speak up about environmental contamination because you believed it was the right thing to do. The consequences have been difficult, but that doesn't mean your choice was wrong." The counseling sessions helped Mark maintain his emotional equilibrium, but they couldn't address the practical problems facing his family. For months after his termination, their savings were nearly exhausted, and Mark had been unable to find another job in the region. He had applied for positions at other manufacturing companies, but had been rejected by all of them. He suspected that Coleman was making good on his threat to blacklist him from employment, but proving such interference would be nearly impossible. Sarah had been exploring options for increasing their income, including the possibility of taking a second job or moving to a different area where Mark might find work. However, moving would mean abandoning their home, their community, and their fight for environmental justice. "Maybe we should consider it," Sarah said one evening as they reviewed their finances. "We could move to Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, where there would be more job opportunities and where your situation here wouldn't be known." Mark felt torn. Part of him wanted to escape the hostility and stress of their current situation. But another part of him felt that leaving would be abandoning the community and allowing North Star to continue contaminating the environment without opposition. "If I leave now, who's going to keep pushing for cleanup of the contamination?" he asked. "Who's going to make sure the EPA follows through on enforcement? Who's going to support Dr. Walsh's health study?" Emma, home for winter break, joined the conversation. "Dad, you've already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. You've brought the problem to light, you've gotten the EPA involved, you've documented the violations. Maybe it's time to let others carry the fight forward." "What others?" Mark asked. "Most of the community wants me to disappear. The people who support me are afraid to speak publicly. Dr. Walsh and Maria Rodriguez are doing their jobs, but they're not advocates for the community, they're bureaucrats following procedures." Jake, now a senior in high school, had been listening to the conversation from the kitchen doorway. "Dad, what if we stayed but you took a job somewhere else? You could commute to Pittsburgh or somewhere like that, and we could stay here to see this through." Mark had considered that possibility, but a commute to Pittsburgh would mean leaving home at 5 in the morning and not returning until 8 at night. He would essentially be absent from his family's life during the week, and the additional transportation costs would eat up much of any additional income. The family's discussion was interrupted by a phone call from David Chin. The attorney had news that changed everything about their situation. "Mark, I just got off the phone with North Star's legal team," Chin said. "They want to schedule settlement negotiations." Mark felt a surge of surprise and hope. "Settlement? What kind of settlement?" "They're not giving details over the phone, but they've indicated they're prepared to discuss both your wrongful termination claim and your environmental whistleblowing. They want to meet next week to discuss terms. After ending the call, Mark shared the news with his family. Everyone had questions about what a settlement might involve and what it might mean for their future. Would a settlement mean we couldn't continue fighting the environmental issues? Sarah asked. It depends on the terms, Mark replied. Some settlements include non-disclosure agreements that would prevent me from discussing anything related to North Star or the contamination. Others might allow me to continue cooperating with regulatory investigations. Emma was skeptical. Why would they want to settle now? They've been fighting us tooth and nail for months. Mark had been wondering the same thing. North Star's aggressive response suggested they were confident in their position and prepared for a long battle. A sudden interest in settlement might mean they had received information that changed their assessment of the risks they faced. The answer came 2 days later, when Maria Rodriguez called with an update on the EPA investigation. Mr. Stevens, I wanted to let you know that our expanded investigation has uncovered additional violations that are more serious than what we initially documented, she said. We found evidence of systematic illegal dumping going back at least 5 years, with contamination levels that pose immediate threats to public health. Rodriguez explained that the EPA was preparing to seek federal criminal charges against North Star Industries and potentially against individual company executives, including Richard Coleman. The agency was also preparing to demand immediate cessation of operations at the Millbrook plant until comprehensive environmental remediation could be completed. The evidence you provided was the key to uncovering this larger pattern of violations, Rodriguez said. Without your initial report, we never would have looked closely enough to find the full scope of the problem. Mark felt vindicated but also deeply concerned about the implications for his community. If the plant was shut down while environmental cleanup was conducted, hundreds of people would lose their jobs, possibly for years. What happens to the workers? Mark asked. That's not really within EPA's jurisdiction, Rodriguez replied. But typically, companies are required to continue paying employees during mandated shutdowns, and there are sometimes federal programs to help workers transition to other employment. When Mark shared this news with his family, their reactions were mixed. They were proud that his actions had exposed serious environmental crimes, but they were also worried about the impact on their neighbors and community. People are going to blame you for the plant closing, Sarah said. Even though North Star created this situation through their own illegal actions, you're going to be seen as the person who brought it all down. Mark knew she was right. In the court of public opinion, he would be held responsible for whatever consequences followed, regardless of the fact that those consequences resulted from North Star's own criminal behavior. The settlement meeting was scheduled for the following Monday, and Mark spent the weekend thinking about what terms he would and would not accept. His primary goal was ensuring that he could continue supporting the EPA investigation and Dr. Walsh's health study. His secondary goal was securing enough financial compensation to provide for his family's immediate needs and make up for the income he had lost. Chen had advised him to think carefully about any non-disclosure agreements. The money might be tempting, especially given your family's financial situation, he said. But once you sign an NDA, you lose your voice on these issues permanently. You wouldn't be able to discuss the contamination, the health impacts, or North Star's behavior with anyone, not the media, not researchers, not even your family in some cases. The settlement meeting was held in a conference room at a downtown Pittsburgh law firm that represented North Star Industries. Mark arrived with David Chen to find a team of 6 corporate attorneys, along with Richard Coleman and a senior executive from North Star's corporate headquarters. The corporate executive introduced himself as James Morrison, Senior Vice President for Environmental Affairs. He was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and an expensive suit, who spoke with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to making problems disappear with enough money and legal maneuvering. Mr. Stevens, I want to begin by saying that North Star Industries respects your concerns about environmental compliance, Morrison said. While we believe your allegations have been exaggerated, we recognize that this situation has been difficult for you and your family. Mark bristled at the suggestion that his allegations were exaggerated, especially given the EPA's recent findings, but Chen had advised him to listen to the full offer before responding. Morrison continued, "We're prepared to offer you a settlement that includes reinstatement to your former position with full back pay, a promotion to Senior Environmental Compliance Officer, and a significant financial payment to compensate for the stress and inconvenience you've experienced." The offer was more generous than Mark had expected. Reinstatement would solve his immediate employment problems, the promotion would give him official responsibility for environmental issues at the plant, and the financial payment would address his family's current needs. "What are the conditions?" Chen asked. Morrison nodded to one of the attorneys, who slid a thick document across the table. "The primary conditions are a non-disclosure agreement regarding all matters related to your employment and your allegations about company operations, a non-disparagement clause that would prevent you from making negative public statements about North Star, and an agreement to cease cooperation with ongoing regulatory investigations." Mark felt his hopes deflate. The conditions would essentially silence him permanently and prevent him from supporting the EPA's investigation or Dr. Walsh's health study. "The non-disclosure agreement is comprehensive," one of the attorneys explained. "It would cover any discussions of environmental issues, waste disposal procedures, regulatory compliance, or any other aspect of plant operations. You would also be prohibited from discussing the existence or terms of this settlement agreement." Chen asked for clarification on several points, including whether Mark would be allowed to respond to subpoenas in criminal investigations and whether he could continue providing information to regulatory agencies if directly requested. Any cooperation with regulatory or law enforcement investigations would require prior approval from company counsel, Morrison said. "We would evaluate such requests on a case-by-case basis." Mark realized that the settlement offer was essentially an attempt to buy his silence and remove him as a threat to North Star's interests. While the financial terms were attractive, accepting the agreement would mean abandoning his efforts to protect public health and hold the company accountable for environmental crimes. "I need time to consider this offer," Mark said. "Of course," Morrison replied. "But I should mention that this offer expires in 72 hours. After that time, we'll be proceeding with our legal defense against all claims and will not be open to further settlement discussions." The deadline was clearly intended to pressure Mark into making a quick decision without fully considering the implications. Chen asked for copies of all the settlement documents, and the meeting ended with handshakes that felt more like formal declarations of war than expressions of goodwill. On the drive back to Millbrook, Chen and Mark discussed the offer in detail. "It's a substantial amount of money," Chen said. "Enough to solve your family's immediate financial problems and provide security for several years. But once you sign that non-disclosure agreement, you lose all leverage in this situation." Mark had already reached the same conclusion. "If I take the settlement, North Star gets to continue polluting while buying my silence. The EPA investigation continues, but without my cooperation it might be weakened. Dr. Walsh's health study proceeds, but without access to my documentation and testimony. On the other hand," Chen pointed out, "if you reject the settlement, there's no guarantee that the EPA investigation will result in meaningful penalties, no certainty that Dr. Walsh's study will prove health impacts, and no assurance that your wrongful termination lawsuit will be successful. You could end up with nothing while your family continues to face financial hardship." Mark understood the risks, but he also understood that accepting the settlement would represent a fundamental betrayal of the principles that had led him to speak out in the first place. That evening, Mark discussed the settlement offer with his family. He explained the financial terms, which would provide more security than they had enjoyed in years, and the restrictions, which would prevent him from continuing his environmental advocacy. "It's a lot of money," Sarah said. "Enough to pay off the mortgage, cover Emma's remaining college expenses, and put Jake through college without student loans." Emma was more skeptical. "Dad, you've spent the last 6 months fighting for environmental justice and public health. If you take their money and sign their non-disclosure agreement, what was all of that suffering for?" Jake had been quiet during the discussion, but finally spoke up. "What if you don't take the settlement and we lose everything? What if the EPA investigation doesn't work out, and Dr. Walsh's study doesn't prove anything, and you can't find another job? What happens to our family then?" It was a fair question, and Mark didn't have a good answer. The settlement offer provided certainty in an uncertain situation, but it also represented capitulation to the very corporate power he had been fighting against. Mark called Dr. Walsh to get her perspective on how the settlement might affect her health study. "Your cooperation has been valuable," Dr. Walsh said, "but I don't think a non-disclosure agreement would prevent me from completing my research. I have access to your initial documentation through the EPA, and I can continue my health surveys and environmental testing independently." Mark also spoke with Maria Rodriguez about the EPA investigation. "We would prefer to have your continued cooperation," Rodriguez said, "but we have enough evidence to proceed with or without your testimony. The real question is whether North Star might be more willing to negotiate a meaningful cleanup agreement if they know you're still actively opposing them." Both conversations suggested that Mark's continued involvement was helpful but not essential to the ongoing environmental efforts. This made the decision more difficult, as it reduced the public benefit of rejecting the settlement while maintaining the personal costs to his family. Mark spent the next 2 days agonizing over the decision. He drove around Millbrook, looking at the neighborhoods where his children had grown up, thinking about the people who lived there and worked at the plant. He walked along Wilson Creek, noting the chemical smell and discolored water that had started his involvement in this battle. On the final day before the settlement deadline, Mark made his decision. He called Chen and asked him to schedule a meeting with North Star's representatives to discuss a counterproposal. "I'll accept the financial settlement and the reinstatement," Mark told Chen, "but I want to negotiate the scope of the non-disclosure agreement. I'm willing to agree not to make public statements about North Star or to cooperate with media coverage, but I want to retain the right to respond to subpoenas and to provide information to regulatory agencies when directly requested." Chen was skeptical that North Star would accept such a counterproposal, but he agreed to present it to their legal team. The response came back within hours. North Star rejected any modifications to the non-disclosure agreement and indicated that their original offer was final and non-negotiable. That evening, Mark called another family meeting to announce his final decision. "I'm going to reject the settlement offer," he said. "I understand the financial risk to our family, and I understand that we might lose everything. But I can't take money to stay quiet about environmental contamination that's poisoning our community." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "I was hoping you would say that," she said. "We'll figure out the money somehow. We always have." Emma hugged her father. "I'm proud of you, Dad. It would have been easy to take the money, but you're doing the right thing." Jake nodded his agreement. "We'll get through this as a family." Mark called Chen and formally rejected North Star's settlement offer. The attorney was not surprised by the decision, but he warned Mark that the company's legal response would likely be swift and aggressive. "They've shown you what they're willing to pay to make this problem go away," Chen said. "Now they're going to show you what they're willing to spend to destroy you." North Star's response to Mark's rejection of their settlement offer was everything Chen had predicted and more. Within a week, the company filed a defamation lawsuit against Mark, claiming that his false and malicious allegations about environmental violations had damaged their business reputation and caused financial harm. The lawsuit sought millions of dollars in damages and was clearly designed to intimidate Mark into silence rather than to actually recover money from someone who had no assets. It was a classic example of a slap suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation, designed to silence critics through the threat of expensive litigation. Chen immediately filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit under Pennsylvania's anti-SLAPP statute, arguing that Mark's environmental allegations were protected speech on matters of public concern. However, he warned Mark that the legal battle could take months or years to resolve. "Even if we eventually win the defamation case, North Star will have accomplished their goal of draining your resources and making you think twice about continuing to speak out," Chen explained. The defamation lawsuit was covered extensively in local media, with headlines like, "North Star sues former employee for $3 million. The coverage portrayed the lawsuit as David versus Goliath, but it also reinforced the perception that Mark was a troublemaker who had brought legal and financial problems on himself. At the same time, North Star escalated their public relations campaign against Mark. They hired a professional crisis management firm that specialized in defending corporations against environmental allegations. The firm launched a coordinated media blitz that portrayed Mark as an unstable former employee seeking attention and financial gain. Anonymous sources began providing local reporters with information about Mark's employment history, including minor disciplinary actions and personality conflicts with supervisors that had occurred years earlier. While none of this information was directly relevant to his environmental allegations, it was designed to undermine his credibility and character. The most damaging story appeared in the Millbrook Gazette under the headline, "Stevens Had History of Workplace Disputes." The article detailed several incidents where Mark had disagreed with management decisions or had been critical of safety procedures. While the incidents were minor and had been resolved without formal disciplinary action, they were presented as evidence of a pattern of insubordination and troublemaking. Mark recognized that the information in the article could only have come from his personnel file, which meant that North Star was leaking confidential employment records to damage his reputation. However, proving this violation would require expensive litigation that his family couldn't afford. The publicity campaign was effective in further dividing the community. People who had been neutral or mildly supportive of Mark began to question his motives and credibility. The social media campaign against him intensified, with posts suggesting that he was mentally unstable, financially desperate, or possibly being paid by environmental groups to attack North Star. Sarah faced increasing pressure at her job as rumors circulated that she was feeding confidential county information to her husband for use in his campaign against the plant. While the rumors were false, they created suspicion among her coworkers and supervisors. "They're trying to isolate us completely," Sarah told Mark one evening. "If I lose my job too, we'll have no income at all." Emma's situation at college also became more difficult as word of the defamation lawsuit spread. Some of her journalism professors questioned whether her involvement in her father's case represented an ethical conflict, and she faced criticism from students who accused her of biased reporting. Jake's senior year of high school was increasingly overshadowed by the controversies surrounding his father. College recruiters who had shown interest in his academic achievements began to withdraw their offers, apparently concerned about the negative publicity associated with the Stevens family name. The cumulative pressure on the family was enormous, but it was about to get worse. Dr. Walsh contacted Mark with disturbing news about her health study. "Mark, I need to tell you that I've been getting pressure from the university administration to scale back my research," she said. Apparently, North Star has complained to the university president about the study, claiming it's biased and scientifically unsound. Dr. Walsh explained that North Star had hired their own team of health experts to challenge her methodology and conclusions. They argued that her sample size was too small, her survey questions were leading, and her statistical analysis was flawed. "The university is worried about losing corporate funding from North Star and other companies," Dr. Walsh said. "They've asked me to submit my research to additional peer review before proceeding, which could delay publication by months or years." Mark felt like walls were closing in from all directions. North Star was using their economic power to pressure not just his family, but also the academic researchers and regulatory agencies that were investigating their environmental violations. However, there was one development that provided hope. Maria Rodriguez called with news that the EPA's criminal investigation was proceeding rapidly. "Mr. Stevens, I can't discuss details of an ongoing criminal investigation, but I can tell you that federal prosecutors are very interested in this case," she said. "The evidence of systematic environmental violations is overwhelming, and there appears to be documentation showing that company executives knew about the illegal dumping and chose to continue it rather than invest in proper waste treatment." Rodriguez explained that criminal environmental prosecutions were rare but carried severe penalties, including the possibility of prison sentences for corporate executives who knowingly violated environmental laws. "If the criminal case is successful, it would vindicate your decision to speak out and might provide leverage for getting North Star to agree to comprehensive environmental cleanup," she said. The prospect of criminal charges against North Star executives was encouraging, but Mark knew that criminal investigations could take years to complete, and there was no guarantee of successful prosecutions. Meanwhile, the financial pressure on the Stevens family was becoming critical. Mark had been unable to find employment anywhere in the region, and their savings were completely exhausted. They were facing the possibility of foreclosure on their home and had begun selling personal belongings to pay for basic necessities. David Chen had been working on Mark's wrongful termination case, but he warned that it could take years to reach resolution and that victory was not guaranteed. North Star will argue that you were fired for legitimate business reasons unrelated to your environmental allegations, Chen explained. Proving retaliation in wrongful termination cases is always challenging, especially when the employer has documented other reasons for the dismissal. The most difficult moment came when Jake approached his parents about his college plans. Several universities that had offered him scholarships were now questioning whether those offers would be honored, apparently concerned about the controversies surrounding his family. "Maybe I should take a gap year," Jake suggested. "Work for a year to help out financially, and then apply to colleges when this situation is more settled." Mark was devastated by the suggestion. His son shouldn't have to sacrifice his educational opportunities because of his father's decision to speak out about environmental violations. "Absolutely not," Mark said firmly. "We'll figure out the finances somehow, but you're going to college next year as planned." However, privately, Mark wasn't sure how they would manage Jake's college expenses without any income or savings. The family was facing not just financial ruin, but the possibility that Mark's environmental advocacy would permanently damage his children's futures. It was at this lowest point that Mark received an unexpected phone call from Margaret Thompson, the retired teacher who had privately expressed support for his actions months earlier. "Mark, I've been watching what North Star is doing to your family, and I can't stay silent anymore," she said. "I'm organizing a group of community members who support your environmental concerns. We want to help." Margaret explained that she had been quietly reaching out to people who were concerned about environmental contamination but had been afraid to speak out. The group included parents worried about their children's health, retirees who remembered when Wilson Creek ran clear, and even some current North Star employees who had witnessed suspicious activities. "We're calling ourselves Citizens for Environmental Justice," Margaret said. "We want to provide financial support for your family and to advocate publicly for environmental cleanup." The emergence of organized community support was a turning point for Mark's morale. For months, he had felt isolated and under attack from his neighbors. Learning that a significant number of people actually supported his actions but had been intimidated into silence gave him renewed energy for the fight. Citizens for Environmental Justice organized a fundraising drive that raised several $1,000s for the Stevens family's immediate needs. More importantly, they began attending city council meetings and organizing petition drives calling for environmental cleanup and health monitoring. Margaret Thompson proved to be an effective organizer and spokesperson. As a respected retired educator with no financial stake in the controversy, she could advocate for environmental protection without being dismissed as a disgruntled employee or outside agitator. "This isn't about Mark Stevens versus North Star Industries," she told a packed city council meeting. "This is about whether we're going to allow our community to be poisoned for the sake of corporate profits." The Citizens Group also provided emotional support that was crucial for the Stevens family. For the first time in months, Mark felt like he wasn't fighting alone against impossible odds. Emma decided to write a follow-up article about the community organizing efforts and the broader implications of corporate environmental accountability. Her piece, published in a regional magazine, focused on how ordinary citizens could challenge corporate power when government regulators moved too slowly. The article attracted national attention and was picked up by several environmental advocacy organizations. Suddenly, Mark's local battle became part of a broader national conversation about environmental justice and corporate accountability. The national attention brought additional support, including pro bono legal assistance from environmental lawyers and financial contributions from advocacy groups around the country. For the first time since the battle began, Mark felt like he had adequate resources to fight North Star on equal terms. The breakthrough came 18 months after Mark first contacted the EPA, when federal prosecutors announced criminal indictments against North Star Industries and 3 company executives, including Richard Coleman. The indictments charged the defendants with conspiracy to violate the Clean Water Act, illegal disposal of hazardous waste, and obstruction of justice for their attempts to cover up the environmental violations after Mark's initial report. According to the federal prosecutor's statement, North Star had saved millions of dollars over 5 years by illegally dumping toxic waste instead of properly treating it. The company's internal documents, obtained through search warrants, showed that executives knew about the illegal dumping and had deliberately chosen to continue it rather than invest in compliant waste treatment systems. This case represents corporate environmental crime at its worst, U.S. Attorney Patricia Williams said at a press conference. The defendants knowingly contaminated their community's water supply and then attempted to silence and destroy the whistleblower who brought these crimes to light. The criminal indictments completely vindicated Mark's decision to speak out. The federal charges were based largely on the evidence he had provided and the documentation he had maintained. Without his initial report, the systematic environmental violations would have continued indefinitely. Richard Coleman was arrested at his home and charged with multiple felonies carrying potential prison sentences of up to 20 years. The other executives were also arrested, and North Star Industries faced criminal fines that could reach into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The news of the criminal charges sent shockwaves through Millbrook. Many residents who had criticized Mark for attacking the plant now realized that he had been right all along about the environmental violations. Gary Morrison, the man who had confronted Mark at the town hall meeting, stopped by the Stevens house to apologize. "Mark, I owe you an apology," Morrison said. "I was so worried about losing my job that I couldn't see you were trying to protect all of us. I'm sorry for what I said and for how some of us treated you." Similar apologies came from other community members who had opposed Mark's environmental advocacy. The criminal charges made it impossible to deny that serious violations had occurred and that Mark had been acting in the community's best interests. The environmental cleanup required by the federal charges was comprehensive and expensive. North Star was ordered to immediately halt all operations at the Millbrook plant until extensive environmental remediation could be completed. The company was also required to provide alternative water supplies for affected residents and to pay for long-term health monitoring for the entire community. Dr. Walsh's health study was completed and published in a peer-reviewed environmental health journal. The study found statistically significant correlations between proximity to the plant and several serious health conditions, including respiratory disease, certain cancers, and neurological problems. The evidence strongly suggests that the illegal waste disposal documented by Mr. Stevens was causing real harm to public health, Dr. Walsh told reporters. His decision to speak out likely prevented additional health impacts and possibly saved lives. The combination of criminal charges and health impacts provided overwhelming justification for Mark's decision to blow the whistle on North Star's environmental violations. However, the personal and financial costs to his family had been enormous. The wrongful termination lawsuit was settled out of court, with North Star agreeing to pay significant damages to Mark and to provide a positive employment reference. The defamation lawsuit was dismissed under Pennsylvania's anti-SLAPP statute, with North Star ordered to pay Mark's legal fees. David Chin negotiated a comprehensive settlement that included financial compensation for lost wages, emotional distress, and damage to Mark's reputation. The settlement also included an agreement that North Star would not interfere with Mark's future employment opportunities. This case demonstrates the importance of protecting environmental whistleblowers, Chin said. Mr. Stevens sacrificed his career and his family's financial security to protect public health. The legal system ultimately vindicated his decision, but the personal costs were nearly overwhelming. The financial settlement provided security for the Stevens family and allowed Jake to attend college without taking on excessive student loan debt. Emma graduated from journalism school and was hired by a major metropolitan newspaper to cover environmental issues. Mark was offered several job opportunities, including positions with environmental consulting firms and government agencies. He chose to work as an environmental compliance officer for the state environmental agency, where he could help investigate similar cases of corporate environmental violations. "I learned that one person speaking out can make a difference," Mark reflected in an interview with Emma's newspaper. "But I also learned that corporate power is so entrenched that it takes tremendous personal sacrifice to challenge it successfully. We need better legal protections for whistleblowers and stronger enforcement of environmental laws." The Millbrook plant remained closed for 3 years while environmental cleanup was completed. During that time, Many workers found employment at other facilities or received retraining through federal programs. When the plant eventually reopened under new ownership, it operated with state-of-the-art environmental controls and comprehensive monitoring systems. Wilson Creek was extensively cleaned and restored, with native fish species returning for the first time in years. The creek became a symbol of environmental recovery and a reminder of the importance of holding corporations accountable for their environmental impacts. Margaret Thompson and the Citizens for Environmental Justice group continued their advocacy work, monitoring environmental compliance and supporting other whistleblowers who reported corporate environmental violations. Their success in the North Star case became a model for other communities facing similar environmental challenges. 5 years after Mark Stevens first witnessed illegal dumping behind the North Star plant, he stood on the banks of Wilson Creek watching his grandson skip stones on the clear water. The creek ran clean for the first time in over a decade, supporting populations of trout and other native fish that had returned as water quality improved. The environmental remediation had cost North Star Industries over $200 million, making it one of the most expensive corporate environmental cleanups in Pennsylvania history. The criminal prosecutions had resulted in prison sentences for 2 company executives, including 18 months for Richard Coleman, and criminal fines totaling $150 million. Mark's family had recovered from the financial devastation of his whistleblowing decision, but the emotional scars took longer to heal. Sarah had eventually left her job at the county clerk's office to work as an advocate for environmental justice organizations. Emma had become an award-winning environmental journalist, and Jake was in his senior year of college studying environmental engineering. "Dad, do you ever regret speaking out?" Jake asked during a visit home from college. "I mean, knowing how much it cost our family, would you do it again?" Mark considered the question carefully. The battle against North Star had nearly destroyed his family financially and had subjected them to years of stress, isolation, and hostility from their own community. There had been times when he wondered if the personal costs were worth the environmental benefits. "The hardest part wasn't the financial pressure or even the legal battles," Mark said. "The hardest part was feeling like I was fighting alone, like the whole community was against me for trying to protect them." He paused, watching the clear water flow over the rocks where toxic chemicals had once pooled. "But I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't spoken up. How many more years would the illegal dumping have continued? How many more people would have gotten sick? How much more damage would have been done to the creek and the groundwater?" Dr. Walsh's follow-up health studies had documented significant improvements in community health after the environmental cleanup was completed. Rates of respiratory illness, skin conditions, and certain cancers had all decreased in neighborhoods near the former plant. While it was impossible to prove direct causation, the timing strongly suggested that eliminating the toxic exposures had prevented additional health problems. "I think about Mrs. Martinez's grandchildren, who can now play safely near the creek," Mark continued. "I think about the families who don't have to worry about their drinking water being contaminated. I think about the workers who now have jobs at a plant with proper environmental controls instead of one that was slowly poisoning the community." Mark had become something of an expert on environmental whistleblowing, frequently speaking at conferences and consulting with other workers who witnessed environmental violations. His experience had taught him that successful environmental advocacy required not just individual courage, but also community support, legal protection, and media attention. "The most important lesson I learned," he told audiences, "is that environmental protection and economic prosperity aren't opposing forces. They're both necessary for healthy communities. Companies that pollute might create jobs in the short term, but they destroy the foundations that communities need for long-term prosperity." The North Star case had contributed to stronger whistleblower protection laws in Pennsylvania and had influenced federal legislation designed to protect employees who report environmental violations. Mark had testified before Congress about the need for better legal protections and financial support for environmental whistleblowers. Sarah had become involved in a national organization that provided support services for whistleblower families, helping them navigate the financial, legal, and emotional challenges of challenging corporate wrongdoing. Her work was inspired by their family's experience and by her recognition that many potential whistleblowers stayed silent because they couldn't afford the personal costs of speaking out. "We were lucky," Sarah reflected during a recent interview. "We had strong family support, we eventually found good legal representation, and we lived in a community where some people were willing to stand up for what was right." But many environmental crimes go unreported because workers know they'll face retaliation and don't have the resources to fight back. Emma's journalism career had flourished, with her environmental reporting earning several national awards. She had covered dozens of cases similar to her father's, documenting patterns of corporate environmental crime and the challenges faced by workers who tried to expose violations. "Dad's case taught me that environmental journalism isn't just about reporting on pollution," Emma said. "It's about examining power structures and holding institutions accountable for their impact on communities." Emma's reporting had exposed environmental violations at companies across the country, contributing to criminal prosecutions, regulatory enforcement actions, and legislative reforms. Her work demonstrated the crucial role that journalism could play in supporting environmental whistleblowers and bringing corporate environmental crimes to public attention. The new Millbrook plant, operated by Green Tech Manufacturing under strict environmental monitoring, employed nearly as many workers as the original North Star facility. The company had invested heavily in clean production technologies and had become a model for environmentally responsible manufacturing. Many of the workers who had initially opposed Mark's environmental advocacy now worked at the new facility and acknowledged that the environmental cleanup had ultimately benefited the community. "I was wrong about Mark Stevens," Gary Morrison admitted at a community meeting celebrating the 5th anniversary of the creek restoration. "I thought he was trying to destroy our jobs, but he was actually trying to save our community. The new plant is better for workers and better for the environment." The Citizens for Environmental Justice group had grown into a regional organization that monitored environmental compliance at industrial facilities throughout central Pennsylvania. Margaret Thompson, now in her 70s, remained active in the organization and continued to advocate for stronger environmental enforcement. "Mark's courage in speaking out showed the rest of us that we didn't have to accept environmental degradation as the price of economic development," Thompson said. "Communities have the right to demand both jobs and clean air and water." The organization had supported whistleblowers in several other environmental cases, providing legal referrals, financial assistance, and emotional support for workers who reported environmental violations. Their success in the North Star case had demonstrated that corporate environmental crimes could be successfully challenged when communities organized effectively. Dr. Walsh had continued her research on environmental health impacts in industrial communities, with funding from federal agencies and environmental foundations. Her work on the Millbrook case had established her as a leading expert on the health effects of industrial contamination and had influenced environmental health policy at state and federal levels. The Millbrook case demonstrated the importance of community-based health research, Dr. Walsh explained. "When residents report health problems that might be connected to environmental contamination, we need to take those concerns seriously and conduct rigorous scientific investigations." Her research methodology, developed during the Millbrook study, had been replicated in other communities facing similar environmental health challenges. The approach emphasized community participation in identifying health concerns and environmental exposures, making it more likely that research would address the actual problems residents were experiencing. David Chen had built a successful practice representing environmental whistleblowers, with the North Star case serving as a precedent for similar litigation. He had won significant settlements and jury verdicts in dozens of environmental retaliation cases, helping to establish legal protections for workers who reported environmental violations. The North Star case showed that environmental whistleblowing can be legally protected and financially vindicated, Chin said. But it also showed how much individual whistleblowers have to sacrifice to hold corporations accountable. "We need systemic changes to make it easier for workers to report environmental violations without risking their livelihoods." Chen had become an advocate for stronger whistleblower protection laws and had worked with environmental organizations to develop model legislation that would provide better legal and financial protections for environmental whistleblowers. As Mark stood by the restored Wilson Creek with his grandson, He reflected on the long journey from his first observation of illegal dumping to the current state of environmental recovery. The personal costs had been enormous, but the environmental and public health benefits had been even greater. "Grandpa, tell me again about how you helped save the creek," his 5-year-old grandson requested, as children often do when they find a story that captures their imagination. Mark smiled and began the story again, focusing on the parts that would make sense to a young child. The bad chemicals in the water, the brave decision to tell the authorities, the long fight to make things right, and the final victory that restored the creek to health. As he told the story, Mark realized that this was perhaps the most important outcome of his environmental advocacy. The next generation would grow up in a community where clean water and air were protected, where workers felt empowered to report environmental violations, and where corporate accountability was expected rather than exceptional. The battle had been difficult and costly, but it had been worth fighting. And if similar circumstances arose again, Mark knew he would make the same choice, armed with the knowledge that individual courage, combined with community support and legal protection, could successfully challenge even the most powerful corporate interests. The sun was setting over Millbrook as Mark and his grandson walked home along the creek bank, the water running clear and clean toward the Susquehanna River and the communities downstream. The fight for environmental justice never truly ended, Mark thought, but battles could be won, communities could be protected, and ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they found the courage to speak out for what was right. In the end, that courage, and the willingness of others to support those brave enough to use it, had made all the difference in the world.